Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s. So as the 1980s come in, we see a rise in conservatism. We see where the conservatives are going to begin to take more power, which was very different than the 70s and the late 60s. Groups like the New Right, the Moral Majority, and the Conservative Coalition are going to gain support. They're going to be able to begin to make some changes in society and in policies. This will last, this conservatism. It's kind of where the Republican Party is going to be in charge during the 80s. That conservatism is going to stay in effect until Bill Clinton becomes president in 1992. And it's important to remember that the reason that we see this upturn in conservatism, or this rise of conservatism and groups like the New Right and the Moral Majority really beginning to take power, is that we had all those problems in the 1970s where we saw inflation, we saw problems with having, we saw gas shortages, we saw problems in the Middle East. And so this is really going to push people to look for a new direction. So just a little bit on the New Right. The New Right focused really on social issues. They're going to take on social issues like abortion, following Roe versus Wade, returning of school prayer into schools, and blocking the Equal Rights Amendment. So you're going to see a lot of gospel back on TV. You're going to see a lot of religious shows. You're going to see a lot of religious leaders who begin to take a prominent place in the U.S. So when we're talking about the election of 1980, only like 52.6% of Americans voted, so that's like half of Americans who could vote did vote. It was really low, and this is going to be the beginning of a tide that we see in the United States where voter turnout, or that's the number of people who go out to vote, is really, really low. Ronald Reagan will win the election in 1980 with 51% of the votes. His vice president is going to be George Bush. So we're just going to watch a short little thing on Ronald Reagan as president.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
President Ronald Reagan presided over the end of the Cold War and left an unforgettable legacy. Dutch, as he was known as a boy, came of age in Illinois during the Great Depression. The Reagan family never settled too long in one place. Reagan's father, Jack Reagan, was a shoe salesman with a drinking problem.
I think that Reagan learned to shut out the unpleasantness in life.
By the late 1930s, Reagan found himself in Hollywood, working as an actor.
I hope those gunners can hold him off.
Reagan settled comfortably into Hollywood life. In 1940, he married leading lady Jane Wyman, and they had 2 children. He also became president of the Screen Actors Guild. But by 1948, his marriage unraveled, and Reagan became interested in politics. He also found a new companion.
She could listen to Ronnie talk all night.
Ronald Reagan married actress Nancy Davis in 1952. With wife Nancy, Reagan found his #1 cheerleader and supporter.
They never tired of talking politics.
A group of California businessmen became impressed by the charismatic actor and convinced him to run for governor. Reagan's political popularity was picking up momentum, and by 1980 he landed in the White House. Then, 2 months later, tragedy struck. In a failed assassination attempt, Reagan was shot. Reagan's speedy recovery put him back in the White House, and he easily slipped into a second term as president.
Thank you very much.
By 1987, Reagan signed the landmark nuclear arms treaty with the Soviet Union, officially ending the Cold War.
There is a great bond that draws the American and Soviet peoples together. It is the common dream of peace.
So that's just a little bit on the background of Ronald Reagan and kind of what he will accomplish in his presidency. So question, the New Right focused on A, social issues, or B, economic issues. The New Right, this new group that comes in the early 1980s. So the Electoral College, you might have heard this term, especially when we're talking during election years. So what in the world is the Electoral College? Well, this is going to be how people actually become president. So what happens in the United States is that when voters turn out to vote, we cast our vote for who we'd like to see president, and then all of those votes are tallied. And in the majority of states, what then happens is that a set of electors, or these people, are given the task to go to Washington and cast their ballot for the state that they live in for president. So, and it varies. There are a few states who do this differently, but for the majority of states, what happens is whoever that state, the people, the popular vote in that state decides they want as president, the electors then go and cast their vote for that person. The majority of states do require that electors cast their ballot the way that the people in the state voted, but there are a couple of exceptions to that rule, and there are also a couple of states where they actually can split their electoral ballots, and so many can go to one candidate and so many can go to another. There's only a couple of states that do that, and Minnesota is not one of those. So how do we know how many electors each state gets? Well, what they do is they take the number of senators that each state has, which each state gets 2 because that's the equal part, plus the number of representatives that you have in Congress, and that equals the total amount of electors. Throughout the entire United States, there's 538 electoral college votes available. There's 435 voting seats in the House. You have 100 seats in the Senate, plus the Washington, D.C. gets 3. So there we go. We get 538. A candidate has to get 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency. When you and I, or when you get to go out, when we vote, that is called the popular vote. So when the people go out to the polls, that's called the popular vote. So once again, our vote is cast, and then the electors take who the people think in each state should be president, and they cast their ballot for that person. In order to win the presidency, a candidate has to get a majority of the electoral votes. So once a candidate gets 270 electoral votes, then they become president. And there were cases back in post-history where there was a tie, and you might have remembered that from first semester. But that hasn't happened in recent cases. What has happened, however, is that there will be times where a candidate becomes president because they win the Electoral College vote, but they do not win the popular vote or the people vote. This has happened several times in the last few years. We saw this happen with Al Gore in the 1990s. He won the popular vote, but the Electoral College vote went to George W. Bush. We also are going to see this in the most recent election. We saw this with the last election we had, where Trump is going to win the Electoral College vote, but Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So that's the Electoral College. We watched that video, and it kind of talked about that there was an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. It was by a guy named John Hinckley Jr. This happened in 1981, towards the beginning of Reagan's presidency. He does survive this assassination attempt. So when he survives this attempt, however, someone who worked with him, whose last name was Brady, actually gets wounded and he becomes permanently disabled. What this assassination attempt is going to begin is a reform on gun control. And so we're going to have the Brady bill that will be passed in honor of this man who was wounded during the Reagan assassination. And this will begin this debate on gun control and kind of spark this beginning of the idea in the American public of how do we control who has access to guns, or should we control who has access to guns? So question, how is a president elected? We were just talking about this. So how is a president elected? A, by the popular vote, or B, by the Electoral College? How is a president elected? Next question, what was a factor in the 1980s rise of conservatism? So this means that rise of that conservative ideals, where the Republican Party is really going to take a lot of power. Is it A, the collapse of communism, or B, the problems from the 1970s? And that will end our section for today.